راحي كريم عظيم عليم حليم حكيم متين منان رحمن فتاح غفار تواب رزاق شهيد.
Islam. With the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which is simply the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. The session today is Islam compatible with the West? And it's my pleasure to welcome you and the speaker to this gathering, and we're pleased that you've managed to come, and we hope that you get something out of it and that you take a lot more back with you than you came with, okay? Because it's the action afterwards which is important. It's not so important just what we hear, because what comes in goes out, but it's what do we do with it in the form of processing. It's just like the computer, you know, garbage in, garbage out. But what do you do with the processing? And that's the responsibility of each one of us, and each one of us has an obligation to whatever it is that we believe in. So the onus is on us to get as much as we possibly can out of this type of seminar. And we have a respected speaker, a knowledgeable person. So the opportunity is there. It's up to each one of us to avail ourselves of that opportunity to the maximum potential that we can. Now I would like to invite Dr. Tim Winter, aka Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, who's a graduate and a professor at Cambridge University, and somebody, the English middle class path to academia and success. To many others, he's Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, a religious scholar of high eminence. Dr. Winter is undoubtedly one of the most influential thinkers alive today, having made notable contributions in areas relating to Muslim-Christian relations in particular. He also has translated quite a few books, which again is a contribution to the West. He's also assisted in translating the Quran, and he is also actively engaged in the New Muslim Project in Cambridge. So it's time for me to shut up, and it's time for me to invite a guest speaker to come and give his presentation, and I ask you to give a warm welcome and to be particularly attentive to what he has to say. Remember that when I opened this seminar, I said it's how much you get out of it and what you go away with. And now you have the opportunity. You want this? Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. It's a question often raised, isn't it? Is Islam compatible with the West? And usually raised, I think, by those who already think they know the answer. I accepted the invitation to speak this evening on condition that I could say at the outset that actually I don't know the answer to this question. But the reason for that is not perhaps as dismal as might appear. The fact is that the question can't, properly speaking, be addressed in a vacuum. Islam is not a single thing. It's a whole universe of a billion different points of view. Similarly, the West is certainly not a single monolith, but has within itself a huge spectrum of cultures, languages, educational and ideological perspectives. So I can tell you at the outset that what my rather uninteresting conclusion is going to be is that certain forms of Islam certainly are compatible with certain forms of the West, and that there are other forms of being Western that are certainly incompatible with certain other forms of being Muslim. Now, there are people on both sides who don't like that kind of rather woolly conclusion. Basically, I think because they would like the world to be a lot simpler than in fact it is. Particularly those people who feel challenged by rapid change, who feel that perhaps they're in danger of being left behind, who's recently experienced war, turbulence, upheaval, all kinds of transformations that just about every society in the world has experienced within living memory. They're insecure, and therefore what they're looking for is an identity. And if they're going to turn to being Western, or being Muslim, or being Chinese, or being Indian, or being just about anything else as an identity, in other words, if their relationship to their cultural patrimony is on the basis of wanting to be something that is against something that they find threatening, then the chances are that they are going to want their identity to be something very clear-cut and simple and monolithic. So, for instance, to look first of all at the diversity of the West. Muslims often think the West, al-Gharb, is a single thing. Then they come here and it sinks in that in fact the West is a diverse, plural space where an almost indefinite variety of lifestyles and points of view are thriving. What is the West? Sometimes we're invited by politicians to develop something called a Western Islam, or a European Islam, or a British Islam. And we listen to that politely. But actually when we come to scratch our heads and jot down what the specifics of that might look like, nobody can actually do it. Why? Firstly, because Islam is diverse, but also because Britishness is diverse, Europeanness is diverse, being Western is so hopelessly diverse that there simply isn't a checklist, little boxes that you can tick to define whether you're British or not. What would such a checklist actually entail? Perhaps 50 or 100 years ago, almost certainly in fact, it was relatively easy to define what was specifically British. But now, thanks to globalization, it's really very hard to determine. If you walk through the Arndale Centre here in Luton, or even down King's Parade in Cambridge, let alone a more obviously up-to-date international space like an airport terminal, for instance, what is it that's specifically British, or even generically European? The West, perhaps, despite the fact that it is a legally open space where a variety of perspectives and cultures theoretically can thrive, in practice our culture does tend to produce a certain public uniformity. But what is it that's specifically British or European about our current reality? Not very easy to define. But there are some people in the West who think that it is easy to define. Look at the BNP's website and the latest musings of Nick Griffin and his people, and you'll find that they're very clear that there is indeed such a thing as being British. And the thing that they're most clear about what it is to be British is that it's incompatible with Islam. In fact, the principal reason why people join far-right neo-Nazi movements in modern Europe, and they are thriving, and there are equivalent movements in the United States, Australia, and elsewhere, is because they want to define themselves as being what is not Muslim. And that's a long strand of Western thinking about self-definition. How did Europe originate, after all? The Romans didn't work with a category called Europe, still less with an idea of the West. When did it begin? Well, you could say that it began with the rise of Islam. Islam invented Europe, Islam invented the West, because whereas the Romans had been a Mediterranean civilization, when Islam took over the southern and eastern coasts of the Mediterranean, what was left of the Western culture was the barbarian kingdoms of the West, and what was left of Byzantium. So when they came to design the new euro banknotes, and again they scratched their heads in Brussels and tried to figure out what it is that Europe has in common, what defines it, what's a symbol that the Latvians and the British and the Irish and the Italians can all agree on as somehow representing what they are, that you can put on the banknotes. They couldn't come up with anything at all except for the map of Europe. And the map of Europe as defined by that part of Europe which is not Islamic. When you go towards the south and the east, you see that the map becomes a little bit vague until